Hi everyone, welcome to our final week of Lit 215 for summer 2021, week 6. I am so proud and excited to see you guys reach the finish line here, and I'll let you in on a little secret. This is actually my first time teaching Lit 215, and so I really appreciate all of the feedback and all of the kind of input from you all over the course of the last 6 weeks. I think I've learned a lot, and I hope that you have too. I recently just moved into a new apartment with my fiance, and I'm finally getting settled in and feel like I can take a deep breath before the fall semester starts. So if you all are around on the Granite City campus in the fall, or if you are interested in other English courses, I do teach full time. So hopefully I will see you again. But let's get started with our final kind of push of information for this week. We're going to talk a little bit about the late 40s and 50s in contemporary literature in general, and then specifically African American literature, which is our focus for this week. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a couple reminders. Your assignments for week 6 are pretty straightforward. You've got your final reading quiz due Wednesday this week instead of Thursday, so keep that in mind. And then the discussion board is also due Wednesday. Please respond to others by Friday. And on Friday, your literary project final draft and reflection are due. So this is pretty much some like kind of housekeeping, sort of getting through the rest of the materials for our course, and just keep in mind that our class officially ends on Friday, August 13th. So the course on the catalog ends Thursday the 12th, but I wanted to give you all an extra day to get things together and turned in. So don't forget, August 13th, that is your cutoff, okay? I will not accept late assignments after the 13th at midnight, okay? That's very important because it gives me time to grade your final projects and get those turned in before my deadline. So please keep that in mind. Alrighty, so the last decade we're going to discuss in our course actually has taken us to the very beginning of contemporary literature, to the 1940s and 50s. And this, I think, is a decade that really sets the tone for the rest of contemporary literature. And I think understanding, kind of where our cultural history was at this point really can help us in looking back. So your text calls this era the era of victory culture. So I think that's primarily because the late 40s and 50s were after, yeah, I came unbuttoned here. Crazy. So this is really after World War II, where the US kind of emerged victorious. And this was definitely an era of a lot of optimism, economic prosperity, and military power. At this point in time, particularly for white Americans, the sky was the limit. And we had recently recovered from the Great Depression because of industry that developed during the war. And then also the 50s especially is where we saw an increase in suburbs. So I grew up in the suburbs. I don't know how many of you all also grew up in the suburbs, but this was really important because it was sort of the marking of a sort of significant and new American dream. So that sort of stereotype of a white picket fence, a nuclear family, the idea that you should have a mother and a father and a boy and a girl as children and live with, your dog Fido in the backyard. And it was sort of an idyllic dream to have this. That was like the sort of peak of prosperity at this time. And, as a lot of us know, that's really not the reality for all of America. It was the reality for a lot of white America. But I think what your text sums up here really well. It says here that a culture that appears ebullient and victorious on the surface is invariably masking some form of misery. And I think so, although this time period was seen as an era of optimism and victory, we can't forget that below that image was a lot of problems. All right. And so a few things to keep in mind is that during this time period, we still had Jim Crow and segregation laws in full effect, particularly racial oppression against Black communities in particular, and this widening gap in prosperity between white and Black communities. There was also an increase in Spanish-speaking immigration, so immigrants from not only Mexico, but also Central America, South America, and also an increase in discrimination against those communities, which I think we sort of we saw a lot of in our readings last week. And then additionally, there was definitely this fear and sort of misunderstanding of the ideas of communism and the USSR. This was the start of the Cold War for the US and sort of ushered in the atomic arms race. So really, there was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of good things happening on the surface for America during this time, but not everyone was enjoying that prosperity. And I think that's really important to think about. So two cultural phenomenon that impacted literature at this time are the TV and the car. So at this point in time, if you grew up in the suburbs, most suburban homes had at least one TV. And so if you ask maybe your, I think my parents still remember when they didn't have a TV in their home. And then this was really the start of a sort of technology boom for the US. And this was important for two reasons. One, because more TVs means less reading. So the literature of the time was maybe not reaching the middle class as much as it was higher and lower classes, which is something interesting to think about. And then also because minorities were not represented in TV culture for several decades. So, if you were going to watch TV in your house, you probably were only seeing white people in a situation like those we saw in the suburbs. So there was this idea that America had this very homogenous, very successful, very white outer shell. But we all know that that wasn't truly representative of all of the US. And then also the development of the car, which I won't get into too much here. So just a quick kind of overview of the literature for this week. So we are reading 3 different pieces, all of which are tough. They are difficult readings, but that does not mean that they are not worth reading. So first we've got Malcolm X's autobiography and a piece about Black nationalism and what he sees as the responsibility of white people in that arena. We've also got Martin Luther King Jr.'s The Letter from Birmingham Jail. So if you've read this piece before, maybe in high school or previously, I want you to kind of look at it with a new lens, kind of in the context of all of the, literature that we've approached this session. Do you view it differently? And then finally, we've got Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is a full text, a full book. So if you're interested in reading, the entire book is available on Blackboard, but I'm only asking you to read a small section. And Coates is writing to his son and discussing kind of now the situation for Black Americans and what that means for him and for really all of us. So a couple of themes that you'll notice across these readings is a keen awareness of being marginalized from mainstream society. So that homogeny that was sort of developed in the 50s, this, that the perfect white shell, essentially. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, at the time that they wrote these pieces, they knew they weren't part of that culture and that millions of Black Americans were being actively sort of rejected from that culture. And what does that mean for their communities? And then there's a lot of discussion of American identity and American history in these pieces. So I'm also going to post some information about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X that I think it's important to understand. So if you're not very familiar with either of these figures, or you're not really sure about like sort of the historical context of these pieces, I really encourage you to do a little background digging, because you can't really understand King's letter from Birmingham jail if you don't understand what was happening in Birmingham at the time. All right. So just like some of the current events and maybe instances, for example, of police brutality that Coates discusses, if you are not as aware of those instances, do your research. All right. So if they mention a person or an instance or an event that you're like, I don't know what that is, Google it, look it up, and it'll really help you understand more of the importance of these pieces. So the reason why I paired these three together is because you'll actually notice that Malcolm X in his autobiography mentions Dr. King and how their common goal is sort of represented differently in their approaches. And they were not recognized for their enormous impact on not only the fight for racial equality in Black communities, but also on our history as America. They weren't recognized for that until both of them had passed away. And I don't think that they were rewarded for that either. So although this is kind of a small, short sampling of African American literature, I think they are really iconic pieces and are very interesting to reflect on at the end of our course. And particularly, think about what Coates says in his piece, that race is not the child. No, hold on. I wrote it down. He says specifically that race is the child of racism, not the father. I think this is, so interesting. And, in a multicultural literature course, we can't avoid talking about race. And it's definitely a idea that we're all struggling with and we will continue to struggle with. But the important point is that we do struggle, that we don't ignore it, that we don't walk away, that we look at this face on and ask ourselves, what can I do? All right. So on that note, there are some questions I'd like you all to consider while you are reading these pieces. So first of all, what similarities can you draw between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and their perspectives? Or what differences do you see? What do you think it was like living as a Black person during the 50s and 60s when Martin Luther King and Malcolm X wrote these pieces? And how does that compare to now? Then, what's the responsibility of white people toward Black communities in recognizing and addressing historical oppression and racism? This is a very shameful piece of being a white American, and there's a lot of discussion about reparations, about critical race theory in schools, about how do we really start to truly address these issues. And then finally, is it possible to move forward from our history? Is it possible to forgive, if not forget? And how? All right, so I want you guys to think about these and think about personally, what is your role in this? We're all, regardless of whether you are Black or white or another race or ethnicity, or if you consider yourself kind of a mix of all, where do you stand? And why is it important? So finally, your major assignment for this week is going to be your literary project final draft and a reflection. So if you've conferenced with me during week 5, please use that feedback in working on your final draft, but also don't forget to check your grade for the draft from week 5 and the feedback that I've given you. Double check the assignment sheet and the rubric. Make sure that you haven't made any mistakes, because after Friday, you can't make any changes. All right, and then there's a reflection with a few questions from the project and the class in general. Please answer those as honestly as possible. I really use that feedback, and I will definitely be teaching this course again. I think I'm teaching a section this fall, and I'm excited to kind of keep developing our work together. And then finally, thank you. This has been an incredible journey over the last few weeks. I am just very grateful to all of you. So thank you, and I hope I see you soon.